Russell at the age of 25. He wrote it at the request of his homosexual brother-in-law, who edited a magazine called The Golden Urn. Even then, Bertrand Russell was a very, very evil man. He was so evil that after the first euphoria of VE Day and VJ Day had barely subsided, Russell began calling for launching a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. This madman was willing to launch World War III in 1945. Billions more men, women, and children would be killed in such a war. But this was not a problem for the Russell who would write 6 years later, in 1951, at present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War so far has had no very great effect on this increase, which continued throughout each of the world wars. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect. Of course, Russell proved to be ahead of his time. Only after the assassination of President Kennedy and the ugly Vietnamese War would his views begin to appear credible. In 1945, anyone who advocated a conference such as the Cairo Conference would have immediately been recognized as a Nazi. In the next hour, we will allow Russell and a number of his collaborators to reveal their secret agenda, how they plotted to build the ultimate terror weapon, an atomic bomb, so that they could use it to control the world. In 1945, on August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb, a uranium device, on the city of Hiroshima. The devastation from this attack was so great that at first the government in Tokyo could not even find out what had happened because there was no communication left with the region. A second nuclear attack was planned for August 10th, but the timing was moved up one day, lest the Japanese surrender before this plutonium bomb could be tested. And so, just 3 days later, on August 9th, the oldest Christian city in Japan, Nagasaki, was bombed. Desperately, the Japanese were trying every way to contact the American government in order to surrender. Finally, the war did end 1 day later. The Japanese people suffered horrendously during the war, and particularly at its end. But in a very definite sense, the American people also have been victimized. For 50 years, the threat of nuclear warfare has been used as a battering ram to destroy the whole of the moral fabric of our society. This is what the twisted Bertrand Russell and his friends planned, and they have almost succeeded. The lives of every one of us in this room have been shaped by Bertrand Russell and his ugly associates. Are you a scientist? Don't you know that science is destroying the biosphere? You're a clergyman. A Christian? How dare you preach that man is superior to animals? You told your child not to have sexual relations? This is a clear case of child abuse. For 50 years, Russell and his friends have been trying to brainwash us into accepting their degraded notion of the inherent bestiality of man. And now it is taught in almost every classroom. In his 1951 book, The Impact of Science on Society, Bertrand Russell explained his plan for the new society. Let's listen to him again.
Life is a brief, small, and transitory phenomenon in an obscure corner, not at all the sort of thing that one would make a fuss about if one were not personally concerned. The danger of a world shortage of food may be averted for a time by improvements in the technique of agriculture. But if population continues to increase at the present rate, such improvements cannot long suffice. Such a situation can hardly fail to lead to world war.
World War II, in fact, had hardly ended before that self-styled pacifist, that man of peace, Bertrand Russell, was urging the preemptive nuclear bombing of the Soviet Union. In 1959, he discussed the apparent contradiction in a BBC interview. Lord Russell, is it true or untrue that in recent years you advocated that a preventative war might be made against communism, against the Soviet Union?
It's entirely true, and I don't repent of it now. It was not inconsistent with what I think now. At that time, nuclear weapons existed only on one side, and therefore the odds were the Russians would have given away. I thought they would.
Well, suppose they hadn't given away.
I thought and hoped that the Russians would give way, but of course you can't threaten unless you're prepared to have your bluff called.
At that time, Russell wanted to enforce the kind of United Nations policing powers over the Soviet Union which are in force against Iraq today. The same kind of IAEA controls which have almost brought us to war with North Korea over the ridiculous claim that they were stockpiling bomb-grade plutonium. Russell understood that in order to achieve his plan for creating a new imperial government, an empire more powerful than the Venetian Empire, or the Roman Empire, or the British Empire, then it would be necessary to brainwash whole populations. The mass media would be useful. The spread of drugs would help. Encouraging the spread of pornography and promiscuity would also help. All of these were useful tools, but the most important job would be to control the minds of youth. Let's listen to more of what he has to say about this.
I think the subject that will be of most importance is mass psychology. This subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective.
The bomb would be the weapon which would be used to terrorize the people of the world into submission. Let's tune back in on Bertie.
The atom bomb, and still more the hydrogen bomb, have caused new fears, involving new doubts as to the effects of science on human life. If, however, the human race decides to let itself go on living, it will have to make very drastic changes in its way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. We must learn not to say, "Never, better death than dishonor." We must learn to submit to law, even when imposed by aliens whom we hate and despise, and whom we believe to be blind to all considerations of righteousness.
By January of 1945, the Second World War was coming to an end. Victory for the Allies was a foregone conclusion, even though many lives would still be lost. It was even money whether the Japanese or the Germans would be the first to surrender. Japanese representatives had urgently asked the Pope to intercede with President Roosevelt to open negotiations for ending the war, and they had made a similar request to Joe Stalin. Pope Pius XII agreed, and a meeting between him and Roosevelt was planned in which this would be one item on the agenda. It never occurred because in April, Roosevelt died and Harry Truman took office.
But wait. Are you saying that we didn't have to drop the bomb to end the war? Now, I always heard that by dropping the bomb and forcing the Japanese military to surrender, millions of lives, American lives and other lives, were saved.
Many people believe this, but it is simply not true. By the summer of 1945, bombing raids on Japan had to be stopped because most of the major cities of Japan had already been destroyed by firestorms. The Japanese no longer had the fuel to defend their cities from air attack. But listen to what Edwin Reischauer had to say on the bombing in his 1986 autobiography. Reischauer, who later was Kennedy's ambassador to Japan, was a colonel in the Special Branch during World War II, the unit which processed all of the intercepts from Japanese military and diplomatic sources during the war in order to translate them. He was horrified when he heard first about the atomic bomb. It was on August 6th, because he and his staff had to be on the lookout for Japanese responses to the bombing. Let's listen to Reischauer, who was on the spot.
On the morning of August the 6th, I was called into the central office of Special Branch, together with about 5 other officers, and told about the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. It was necessary that we know so that we could be on watch for the reaction of the Japanese. We were even given a list of the other potential target cities, which to my horror included Kyoto, though it was fortunately near the bottom. The United States had made a special effort to avoid the destruction of cultural monuments, but Kyoto was the largest of the few cities not yet burned out by firebomb raids, and it was a key railway crossroads. All of us at Special Branch were stunned and dismayed at the news. Through the military and diplomatic messages, we knew how near to defeat Japan already was, and how eager some elements in the government were to bring an end to the fighting. We were aware that the economy was grinding to a halt because the merchant marine had been virtually eliminated by early 1945, and we knew of the many discussions and diplomatic efforts aimed at terminating hostilities then going on. We looked dazedly at one another, and someone muttered something about hitting below the belt when the opponent was already on the ropes. I felt I would burst with the awful secret bottled up inside me. It was therefore a great relief when President Truman made a public announcement about the bomb a few hours later. At the time, I believed the dropping of the atom bomb was a terrible mistake. My own estimate was that Japan would surrender sometime before November. The Japanese would figure that we would not wish to attempt an invasion during the typhoon season, and thus court a repetition of the kamikaze that had destroyed the Mongol invaders of 1281. Following this reasoning, I thought they would count on almost 3 more months in which to bring the war to an end, and I felt certain they would do so during that time. However, the results of historical research since then have made me much less certain about this conclusion. The various alternative proposals for demonstrating the capacities of the bomb without using it on a populated target would probably have been ineffective. Even with 2 atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union, which was launched between the 2 bombings, it was touch and go whether the Japanese military would permit the civilian government to surrender. If there were some possible justification for the first atomic bomb, however, there was none for the second, dropped on Nagasaki on August the 9th. The top American authorities did agonize over the decision to use the first bomb, but seem to have given the second little, if any, thought, snuffing out some 70,000 lives almost inadvertently.
Was there any justification for dropping the bomb? Did it save 1 million lives? As you heard Reischauer admit, no invasion was planned before November. Furthermore, what he does not write, the harbors of Japan had all been mined, and then the mines were taken away to allow a future invasion to proceed. With the harbors impassable, even without the carpet bombing, the Japanese could not have resisted for long because they had to import food and gasoline, not to speak of other essential goods. The bombing of Hiroshima resulted in the immediate deaths of 140,000 people. Within 5 years, 200,000 had died as a result of the bomb or its after effects. This was 54% of the population of the city. The bombing of Nagasaki killed 70,000 on the spot, and within 5 years, the total rose to 140,000. Again, this was more than half the population who had been living in the city. The firebombing of Tokyo had also caused terrible devastation. 100,000 died. But in that city of 1 million people, the death toll was only 10% of those who had been alive.
If that's true, why did they decide to drop the bomb? Is what the lefties claim true? Did Harry Truman okay using the bomb against the Japanese to send a signal to the Soviets? If that is so, why did they build the bomb in the first place?
In the final analysis, it was Harry Truman's call on whether or not to drop the bomb. But Averell Harriman was whispering in his ear that the Soviets were getting out of line and that we needed the bomb to rein Joe Stalin in. And Secretary of War Henry Stimson was telling him that President Roosevelt intended Japan to be the target and that we had to use the bomb in order to show the Soviets that we would play tough. Harry Truman was way over his head, and he didn't have a clue what to do. He hadn't been briefed about most of the details of the war. He had not known about the atom bomb. Now, he had to go to Potsdam to meet with Stalin and Churchill. The man from Missouri was on his way to Potsdam, and he didn't have a clue what to do. So they put a bomb in his pocket. That little man with the bomb could face down the big guys. But let's hear what the plans were of the men who put the bomb in his pocket, so to speak. Let's listen to Russell's words in 1946. These appeared in the 5th issue of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists.
It is entirely clear that there is only one way in which great wars can be permanently prevented, and that is the establishment of an international government with a monopoly of serious armed force. When I speak of an international government, I mean one that really governs, not an amiable facade like the League of Nations or a pretentious sham like the United Nations under its present constitution.
But Dr. Russell, what has this to do with the bomb?
An international government, if it is to be able to preserve peace, must have the only atomic bombs, the only plant for producing them, the only air force, the only battleships, and generally whatever is necessary to make it irresistible. Its atomic staff, its air squadrons, the crews of its battleships, and its infantry regiments must each severally be composed of men of many different nations. There must be no possibility of the development of national feeling in any unit larger than a company. Every member of the international armed force should be carefully trained in loyalty to the international government. The international authority must have a monopoly of uranium and of whatever other raw material may hereafter be found suitable for the manufacture of atomic bombs. It must have a large army of inspectors who must have the right to enter any factory without notice. Any attempt to interfere with them or to obstruct their work must be treated as a casus belli. They must be provided with aeroplanes, enabling them to discover whether secret plants are being established in empty regions near either pole or in the middle of large deserts. The monopoly of armed force is the most necessary attribute of the international government, but it will, of course, have to exercise various governmental functions. It will have to decide all disputes between different nations, and will have to possess the right to revise treaties. It will have to be bound by its constitution to intervene by force of arms against any nation that refuses to submit to the arbitration. Given its monopoly of armed force, such intervention will seldom be necessary and quickly successful. I will not stay to consider what further powers the international government might profitably possess, since those I have mentioned would suffice to prevent serious wars.
Okay, so that's what Russell planned. But what about President Roosevelt? What about the Manhattan Project? I thought that in 1939, Albert Einstein warned Roosevelt that the Germans were about to build an atomic bomb, and that's why we had a crash effort. What about the Manhattan Project?
Yes, many of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project were afraid that the Germans would build an atomic bomb, but not Bertrand Russell, or science policy advisors like Niels Bohr, or even President Roosevelt himself. In the early days of the war, British and American intelligence established that the Germans could not build an atomic bomb and were not even seriously trying to. This was so for many reasons. For one thing, too many top German physicists had been forced to emigrate out of Germany to escape the Nazi terror, or because they opposed the regime. Even though Werner Heisenberg, who was the leading scientist on top of the project, remained, he made it very clear to all of his associates in the United States, Britain, to Niels Bohr and so forth, that he would not produce a bomb for Hitler. And he was in touch with the Allied underground through friends during the war. More to the point, Hitler did not see the need for a major investment like the Manhattan Project, because he knew that if he was going to win the war, it must be by a blitzkrieg. The war had to be won for Germany quickly before the United States military machine came to full strength, or it would not be won at all. By the time that Hitler realized that it would indeed be a long war, Germany could no longer afford the scale of investment necessary. Ostensibly, the bomb was being built to counterbalance a potential Nazi threat, so that if Hitler were to have gotten the bomb, he would still be afraid to use it. But this does not explain the fact that $500 million was allocated to the Manhattan Project after VE Day. The war with Europe was over, and 1/4 of the entire cost of the project was incurred at that time. Nor does it explain why the bombs were used against Japan. In 1939, a grouping in the top reaches of the British policy-making establishment convinced Winston Churchill that now was the time to go with nuclear power. The Americans would have to be brought in on the act because of the enormous cost of the project, but they could be controlled in the long run. The idea of using nuclear energy to build a bomb was not a new idea for the British by any means. Russell wrote about this and his plans to dominate the world on behalf of the British oligarchy in a book called Icarus, or the Future of Science, which he wrote in 1924. There he described how the bomb would be used as a tool to bring about world government. Even that early, he understood that the days of the British Empire were numbered. If the empire was to survive, it would have to be recreated in a different form, as a world government, not a British government. His title, Icarus, is a play on the legend of the scientist who built himself a pair of wax wings, but flew too close to the sun, so that his wings melted. Russell believed that the Icaruses of this world must learn that they cannot fly. They cannot conquer space. Man must stick in the dirt or be destroyed. Let's listen to this greeny Bertrand Russell explain his plans for world government in 1924.
I fear that the same fate may overtake the populations whom modern men of science have taught to fly. Some of the dangers inherent in the progress of science, while we retain our present political and economic institutions, are set forth in the following pages. One general observation to begin with. Science has increased man's control over nature, and might therefore be supposed likely to increase his happiness and well-being. This would be the case if men were rational, but in fact they are bundles of passions and instincts. There is, however, a hopeful element in the problem. The planet is of finite size. Before very long, the technical conditions will exist for organizing the whole world as one producing and consuming unit. If, when that time comes, two rival groups contend for mastery, the victor may be able to introduce that single worldwide organization that is needed. There would be at first economic and political tyranny of the victors, a dread of renewed upheaval and therefore a drastic suppression of liberty. But if the first half-dozen revolts were successfully repressed, the vanquished would give up hope and accept the subordinate place assigned to them by the victors in the great world trust.
The threat of nuclear war was to be the means by which Bertrand Russell intended to create his one world empire. Harvard president James B. Conant was the man who, along with Henry Stimson and Vannevar Bush, was responsible for political supervision of the Manhattan Project. He was a friend of Bertrand Russell. In December of 1940, Russell was scheduled to make a lecture tour of the United States. He wanted to escape from Britain, which was then at war. Many American colleges, like City College, refused to allow him to speak because he was a champion of free love. Dirty Bertie was so unprincipled that he would force his teenage stepdaughter to watch him having sexual intercourse with her governess. Not surprisingly, the young girl had a nervous breakdown. Anyway, one of his few defenders at the time in the United States was his friend, James B. Conant, who invited Russell to give the prestigious annual William James Lectures at Harvard. It was he, Stimson, and Bush who were responsible for urging President Truman to use the bomb against the Japanese. After the war was over, as time went on, many people came to question that act. In answer to criticism by clergymen, Conant wrote in the New York Times on March 6, 1946,
"If the American people ought to be as deeply penitent for the use of the atomic bomb, why should they not be equally penitent for the destruction of Tokyo in the 1,000-plane raid using the M69 incendiary, which occurred a few months earlier? I may say that I was deeply involved with one method of destruction as the other, so at least on these 2 points I can look at the matter impartially. If we are to be penitent for this destruction of Japanese cities by incendiaries and high explosives, we should have to carry over this point of view to the whole method of warfare used against the Axis powers."
He had not changed his mind by 1968 when he answered a similar letter from a Mrs. Popper in the same vein.
You speak of the conflict in the minds of those who were working on the bomb before Hiroshima, probably because of my connection with the use of gas in World War I and my close connections with the sections of the NRDC which were developing napalm incendiary bombs so devastatingly effective against Tokyo the conflict of which you speak hardly existed in my mind.
Firebombing was a technique developed by the British on the basis of their observations of the damage done by incendiary markers used by the Germans to illuminate bombing targets in Britain. It was directed against the civilian populations of Hamburg and Dresden in the last months of the war. It was used to destroy 48 of Japan's largest cities. People caught in a firestorm would die because the oxygen they needed to breathe had been sucked up in an artificially created tornado. Of course, they were also burned alive. The use of such terror tactics against men, women, and children was resisted by the U.S. military command, but ultimately it became the accepted practice of both Britain and the United States Air Force. Still, the potentialities of atomic weapons were far more devastating, both in practice and in principle. The British had practiced the terror bombing of civilian populations on their rebellious colonies since the 1920s. Iraq was one of their targets then. This worried Franklin Roosevelt, and he issued a statement on September 1st, 1939, at the start of World War II, urging all of the belligerents to sign on to a pact which would outlaw the bombing of civilians. In the end, of course, even he signed on to the idea which would come to be called carpet bombing. But the sentiments that he expressed in 1939 were sentiments endorsed by every decent American.
The ruthless bombing from the air of civilians in unfortified centers of population during the course of the hostilities which have raged in various quarters of the earth during the past few years, which has resulted in the maiming and in the death of thousands of defenseless men, women, and children, has sickened the hearts of every civilized man and woman, and has profoundly shocked the conscience of humanity. If resort is had to this form of inhuman barbarism during the period of the tragic conflagration with which the world is now confronted, hundreds of thousands of innocent human beings who have no responsibility for and who are not even remotely participating in the hostilities which have now broken out will lose their lives. I am therefore addressing this urgent appeal to every government which may be engaged in hostilities publicly to affirm its determination that its armed forces shall in no event and under no circumstances undertake the bombardment from the air of civilian populations or of unfortified cities upon the understanding that these same rules of warfare will be scrupulously observed by all of their opponents. I request an immediate reply.
All of the belligerents agreed that they would not bomb innocent civilians. But, of course, they did. President Clinton studied under Carroll Quigley at Georgetown University. Perhaps he was influenced by Quigley's view of the bomb. Quigley wrote in his book, Tragedy and Hope, "The decision to use the bomb against Japan marks one of the critical turning points in the history of our times. We cannot now say that the world would have been better, but we can surely say that it would have been different. We can also say with complete assurance that no one involved in the decision had a complete or adequate picture of the situation. The scientists who were consulted had no information on the status of the war itself, had no idea how close to the end Japan already was, and had no experience to make judgments on this matter. The politicians and military men had no real conception of the nature of the new weapon or of the drastic revolution it offered to human life. To them, it was simply a bigger bomb, even a much bigger bomb, and by that fact alone, they welcomed it. The cost of the Manhattan Project was $2 billion. We can multiply that by at least 10 times to estimate what it would have cost in today's dollars. Majority Leader John W. McCormick joked to friends that if the bomb had not worked, he expected that he would face penal charges for having voted the funding. Some Republicans, notably Congressman Albert J. Engel of Michigan, had already shown signs of a desire to use congressional investigations and newspaper publicity to raise questions about the misuse of public funds. During one War Department discussion of this problem, a skilled engineer, Jack Madigan, said, "If the project succeeds, there won't be any investigation. If it doesn't, they won't investigate anything else." Secretary of War Stimson lied to President Truman that Japan had always been planned as the target for the bomb. In an article written for Atlantic Monthly to justify the decision to the American people, Stimson lied again, saying that Roosevelt had approved of using nuclear weapons against Japan. It's not the truth. The truth is that Roosevelt had left the decision on whether or not to ever use the bomb under any circumstances open. It is extremely unlikely that he would have approved using it on Japan. In 1943, General MacArthur was pressing for reinforcements for the Pacific War against Japan. Roosevelt was very clear at that time that the priority deployment had to be to defeat Hitler. At that time, he believed that once Germany was defeated, then both the war in the United States and the war in the Pacific would be quickly wrapped up. Francis Perkins, in a book about that time, quotes Roosevelt saying,
"It is of the utmost importance that we appreciate that defeat of Japan does not defeat Germany, and that American concentration against Japan in this year of 1943 increases the chance of complete German domination of Europe and Africa. Defeat of Germany means the defeat of Japan, probably without firing a shot or losing a life."
But didn't we need the bomb in order to control the Soviets? If Stalin got the bomb before us, then he could have ruled the world.
But would the Soviets have developed the bomb if we had not done so? Carroll Quigley thought not, because the Russians did not favor strategic bombing. And without knowing that the bomb worked, without the demonstration of its power for all of the world to witness, the Soviets would have thought long and hard before making that scale of investment which would have been needed to develop a bomb from scratch. They did have a long-standing project to build a nuclear reactor. Henry Stimson was a longtime associate of Prescott Bush and the Harriman family. He was an admirer of Theodore Roosevelt. He differed from Russell and the British only in a matter of emphasis. If there was to be a new world government, a perspective with which he did not at all disagree, then the United States should not be a junior partner in the Anglo-American alliance. By February of 1945, President Roosevelt was already mortally ill. This gave the evil Henry Stimson a much freer hand. Even so, he was living in the America of the 1940s. The American people then had not been brainwashed over a 50-year period to accept the terror bombing of civilians as they do now. He feared the reaction of the American people when they realized the truth about the policy of sanctioning strategic bombing and the bombing of Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in particular. This was a problem which 50 years later, his protege, George Bush, did not face. Stimson discussed the question of strategic bombing with Truman on May 16, 1945. Here is what he wrote on that day in his diary about the discussion.
I am anxious to hold our Air Force so far as possible to the precision bombing which it has done so well in Europe. I'm told that it is possible and adequate. The reputation of the United States for fair play and humanitarianism is the world's biggest asset for peace in the coming decades. I believe the same rule of sparing the civilian population should be applied as far as possible to the use of any new weapons.
On June 1st, he wrote another entry in his diary. He had met Truman again, and this time they specifically discussed using atom bombs against Japan.
I told him how I was trying to hold the Air Force down to precision bombing, but that with the Japanese method of scattering its manufacture, it was rather difficult to prevent area bombing. I told him I was anxious about this feature of the war for two reasons. First, because I did not want to have the United States get the reputation for outdoing Hitler in atrocities. And second, I was a little fearful that before we could get ready, the Air Force might have Japan so thoroughly bombed out that the new weapon would not have a fair background to show its strength. He said he understood.
Harry Truman did not know much about the conduct of the war before President Roosevelt's death. He was a little man stepping into a big job, and he was way over his head. Still, what can we think of the following remarks by Truman, written in his diary in July of 1945?
We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. Anyway, we think we have found a way to cause a disintegration of the atom. An experiment in the New Mexican desert was startling, to put it mildly. This weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. I have told Secretary of War Mr. Stimson to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target and not women and children. Even if the Japs are savages, ruthless murderers, merciless and fanatic, we as the leader of the world for the common welfare cannot drop this terrible bomb on the old capital or the new. He and I are in accord. The target will be a purely military one, and we will issue a warning statement asking the Japs to surrender and save lives. I'm sure they will not do that, but we will have given them the chance. It is certainly a good thing for the world that Hitler's crowd, or Stalin's crowd, did not discover this atomic bomb. It seems to be the most terrible thing ever discovered, but it can be made most useful.
Could Truman have really believed that women and children would not be harmed by the bomb? Well, we can each have our own opinion on this, but it is interesting the extent to which he felt it necessary to verbalize what was the view of most Americans of that day. They believed that they were fighting a war to defend the rights of man. On May 27, 1941, President Roosevelt gave a radio address to the nation in which he announced a proclamation of an unlimited national emergency. Many Americans hoped that the United States could still somehow stay out of the war, but the sentiments expressed by Roosevelt were widely held. Let's listen to President Roosevelt's emergency proclamation.
We will not accept a Hitler-dominated world, and we will not accept a world like the post-war world of the 1920s, in which the seeds of Hitlerism can again be planted and allowed to grow. We will accept only a world consecrated to freedom of speech and expression, freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, freedom from want, and freedom from terror.
Harry Truman, on the other hand, had other ideas. In the spring of 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Truman was then a senator, and he rated the two dictatorships as being morally equivalent. Truman recommended that America encourage the Soviet Union and Germany to fight each other to the death.
If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible, although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances. Neither of them think anything of their pledged word.
The four freedoms. This is what most Americans believed that the war to be about. They were fighting for freedom, not to save the British Empire. They were fighting for the men and women all over the world who would have the four freedoms. Roosevelt took his son with him to Casablanca, to the Big Four Summit Conference, which was held there in 1943. One day when they were alone together, he confided his plans to his son.
When we've won the war, I will work with all my might and main to see to it that the United States is not wheedled into the position of accepting any plan that will further France's imperialistic ambitions or that will aid or abet the British Empire in its imperial ambitions.
At a private dinner shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt told his dinner guests that Churchill had to be made to understand the way American people felt about Britain.
Our popular idea of that role may not be entirely objective, may not be 100% true from the British point of view. There it is. And I've been trying to tell him that he ought to consider it. It's in the American tradition, this distrust, this dislike, and even hatred of Britain.
At the start of the war, Roosevelt and Churchill jointly issued the Atlantic Charter. He and Churchill had very different ideas about it. Here is what Roosevelt had to say.
I am firmly of the belief that if we are to arrive at a stable peace, it must involve the development of backward countries. I can't believe that we can fight a war against fascist slavery and at the same time not work to free all people over the world from a backward colonial policy.
Not surprisingly, this was not to the liking of the British War Cabinet, which rejected Roosevelt's interpretation and asserted that the Atlantic Charter could have no reference to the internal affairs of the British Empire. There are many such quotations from Roosevelt's public and private remarks. For example, his advisor Charles Taussig recorded in his diary that the president said he was concerned about the brown people in the East. He said that there were 1.1 billion brown people. In many Eastern countries, they are ruled by a handful of whites, and they resent it. Our goal must be to help them achieve independence. 1.1 billion potential enemies are dangerous. To provide a decent life for these people and the billions who would come after them, nuclear energy would not only be a blessing, but a necessity. Can we then say that at least the bomb opened up the possibility of the use of atoms for peace, to paraphrase President Eisenhower? The answer is no. The discovery of that energy, trapped within the nucleus of atoms, that the energy could be released, was known for decades before the bomb was built. Pierre and Marie Curie, Ernest Rutherford, William Harkin, Enrico Fermi, Ida Nodak, Ada Hahn, Lisa Meitner. Scientists in every nation worked on this project. Their work spanned the century. A crash effort to develop the technological capability to release the energy of the atomic nucleus could have been launched at any time. But this was not to happen because men like Bertrand Russell did not want such a resource to become available. Were the nations of the world to have such a virtually limitless energy resource, his project for world government would be doomed. Indeed, Pierre Curie was literally driven to his death, if he was not actually murdered, by a science mafia run by Britain's Lord Kelvin. Kelvin would not even tolerate Curie's proof that atoms were not the hard balls which Newton described. He tried to destroy the career of Ernest Rutherford and his collaborator Frederick Soddy. In 1908, though, despite this, Soddy wrote a book about the new atomic science, which was reprinted time and time again. It was based on a series of lectures which he gave each year to working people to describe the new science and acquaint them with the promise of nuclear energy. Here are some of the things which he had to say about nuclear energy 35 years before the bomb was built, and 30 years before 1939, when the possibility of fissioning the nucleus was definitely established.
Let us consider, in the light of present knowledge, the problem of transmutation and see what the attempt of the alchemist involved. To build up an ounce of a heavy element like gold from a lighter element like silver would require, in all probability, the expenditure of the energy of some hundreds of tons of coal, so that the ounce of gold would be dearly bought. On the other hand, if it were possible artificially to disintegrate an element with a heavier atom than gold and produce gold from it, so great an amount of energy would probably be evolved that the gold in comparison would be of little account. The energy would be far more valuable than the gold. We stand today where primitive man first stood with regard to the energy liberated by fire. We are aware of its existence solely from the naturally occurring manifestations in radioactivity. When we have learned to transmute the elements at will into the other, then, and not till then, will the key to this hidden treasure house of nature be in our hands. The real wealth of the world is its energy. And by these discoveries, it, for the first time, transpires that the hard struggle for existence on the bare leavings of natural energy in which the race has evolved is no longer the only possible or enduring lot of man. It is a legitimate aspiration to believe that one day he will attain the power to regulate for his own purposes the primary fountains of energy which nature now so jealously conserves for the future. The fulfillment of this aspiration is no doubt far off, but the possibility alters somewhat the relation of man to his environment and adds a dignity of its own to the actualities of existence.
In 1914, on the eve of the First World War, H.G. Wells wrote the scenario which was followed by Bertrand Russell and which led to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The name of the book was The World Set Free. As you listen to what he wrote then, think about how different the world is now from what it was before 1945. Contrast the hopes expressed by Franklin D. Roosevelt with the reality dictated by Wells and Russell. The book begins with a parody of Sadi's vision. A young scientist hears one of Sadi's lectures and embarks upon the project of developing nuclear energy. By 1956, he has succeeded, and nuclear power has created untold riches for some, but it has also created a situation in which the rich get richer while the poor get poorer and are put out of work. Worse yet, war begins as nations begin to fight each other over patent rights. This is to be an atomic war, and all of the world's greatest cities are quickly destroyed. Paris, London, Rome, New York, Tokyo, all and more are rubble. Former kings and princes and bureaucratic functionaries come together and declare that they are going to create a new world order under their rule. No longer will there be separate nations. No longer will people be given the franchise. This is to be a world government. Here is H.G. Wells' vision of the future. It is to be a self-perpetrating one-world dictatorship.
After the conflagration from the bombs, people were unable to live in the cities anymore. English became the universal language, shorn of such peculiarities of grammar as the subjunctive mood. The metric system became universal, but also a strict 13-month lunar calendar with certain additional days. a universal energy-based currency was used. Education was reformed, reinterpreting history in order to instill a new faith in the hearts of the young. Children were to be taught about Bismarck, that hero of 19th century politics, that sequel to Napoleon, that god of blood and iron. He was just a beery, obstinate, dull man. All Europe offered its children to him. It sacrificed education, art, happiness, and all its hopes of future welfare to follow the clatter of his saber. Everybody in those days, wise or foolish, believed that the division of the world under a multitude of governments was inevitable, and that it was going on for thousands of years more. It was inevitable until it was impossible.
There's a tape change, so we have a slight pause. In actual fact, the first nuclear war was fought in 1945. Out of it did not come H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell's world government, not according to the scenario which Wells laid out, but the America which Stimson and Truman feared would condemn their action. The America that hated the British oligarchy and all that it stood for is long gone. To understand why Russell and Wells were so successful in undermining the foundations of our republic, we must look back in time, not just to 1945 or 1908, but we must look back over at least 600 years of human history. Into submission. Let's tune back in on Bertie.
The atom bomb, and still more the hydrogen bomb, have caused new fears involving new doubts as to the effects of science on human life. If, however, the human race decides to let itself go on living, it will have to make very drastic changes in its way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. We must learn not to say, never, better death than dishonor. We must learn to submit to law, even when imposed by aliens whom we hate and despise, and whom we believe to be blind to all considerations of righteousness.
By January of 1945, the Second World War was coming to an end. Victory for the Allies was a foregone conclusion, even though many lives would still be lost. It was even money whether the Japanese or the Germans would be the first to surrender. Japanese representatives had urgently asked the Pope to intercede with President Roosevelt to open negotiations for ending the war, and they had made a similar request to Joe Stalin. Pope Pius XII agreed, and a meeting between him and Roosevelt was planned in which this would be one item on the agenda. It never occurred because in April, Roosevelt died and Harry Truman took office.
But wait. Are you saying that we didn't have to drop the bomb to end the war? Now, I always heard that by dropping the bomb and forcing the Japanese military to surrender, millions of lives, American lives and other lives, were saved.
Many people believe this, but it is simply not true. By the summer of 1945, bombing raids on Japan had years. Russell and his friends have been trying to brainwash us into accepting their degraded notion of the inherent bestiality of man. And now it is taught in almost every classroom. In his 1951 book, The Impact of Science on Society, Bertrand Russell explained his plan for the new society. Let's listen to him again.
Life is a brief, small, and transitory phenomenon in an obscure corner. Not at all the sort of thing that one would make a fuss about if one were not personally concerned. The danger of a world shortage of food may be averted for a time by improvements in the technique of agriculture. But if population continues to increase at the present rate, such improvements cannot long suffice. Such a situation can hardly fail to lead to world war.
World War II, in fact, had hardly ended before that self-styled pacifist, that man of peace, Bertrand Russell, was urging the preemptive nuclear bombing of the Soviet Union. In 1959, he discussed the apparent contradiction in a BBC interview. Lord Russell, is it true or untrue that in recent years you advocated that a preventative war might be made against communism, against the Soviet Union?
It's entirely true, and I don't repent of it now. It was not inconsistent with what I think now. At that time, nuclear weapons existed only on one side, and therefore the odds were the Russians would have given away. I thought they would.
Well, suppose they hadn't given away.
I thought and hoped that the Russians would give way, but of course you can't threaten unless you're prepared to have your bluff called.
At that time, Russell wanted to enforce the kind of United Nations policing powers over the Soviet Union which are in force against Iraq today. The same kind of IAEA controls which have almost brought us to war with North Korea over the ridiculous claim that they were stockpiling bomb-grade plutonium. Russell understood that in order to achieve his plan for creating a new imperial government, an empire more powerful than the Venetian Empire, or the Roman Empire, or the British Empire, then it would be necessary to brainwash whole populations. The mass media would be useful. The spread of drugs would help. Encouraging the spread of pornography and promiscuity would also help. All of these were useful tools, but the most important job would be to control the minds of youth. Let's listen to more of what he has to say about this.
I think the subject that will be of most importance is mass psychology. This subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective.
The bomb would be the weapon which would be used to terrorize the people of the world. Could use it to control the world. In 1945, on August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb, a uranium device, on the city of Hiroshima. The devastation from this attack was so great that at first the government in Tokyo could not even find out what had happened because there was no communication left with the region. A second nuclear attack was planned for August 10th, but the timing was moved up one day, lest the Japanese surrender before this plutonium bomb could be tested. And so, just 3 days later, on August 9th, the oldest Christian city in Japan, Nagasaki, was bombed. Desperately, the Japanese were trying every way to contact the American government in order to surrender. Finally, the war did end 1 day later. The Japanese people suffered horrendously during the war, and particularly at its end. But, in a very definite sense, the American people also have been victimized. For 50 years, the threat of nuclear warfare has been used as a battering ram to destroy the whole of the moral fabric of our society. This is what the twisted Bertrand Russell and his friends planned, and they have almost succeeded. The lives of every one of us in this room have been shaped by Bertrand Russell and his ugly associates. Are you a scientist? Don't you know that science is destroying the biosphere? You're a clergyman. A Christian? How dare you preach that man is superior to animals? You told your child not to have sexual relations? This is a clear case of child abuse. For 50 years, Bertrand Russell, at the age of 25, he wrote it at the request of his homosexual brother-in-law, who edited a magazine called The Golden Urn. Even then, Bertrand Russell was a very, very evil man. He was so evil that after the first euphoria of VE Day and VJ Day had barely subsided, Russell began calling for launching a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. This madman was willing to launch World War III in 1945. Billions more men, women, and children would be killed in such a war. But this was not a problem for the Russell who would write 6 years later, in 1951, at present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War so far has had no very great effect on this increase, which continued throughout each of the world wars. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect. Of course, Russell proved to be ahead of his time. Only after the assassination of President Kennedy and the ugly Vietnamese War would his views begin to appear credible. In 1945, anyone who advocated a conference such as the Cairo Conference would have immediately been recognized as a Nazi. In the next hour, we will allow Russell and a number of his collaborators to reveal their secret agenda, how they plotted to build the ultimate terror weapon, an atomic bomb, so that they